So the wheels had been set in motion for war. So we're going to talk about the war. To begin, naval battles. Now remember that the Republicans, under Thomas Jefferson, had reduced the size of the Navy from 25 ships to 7. But the United States still had 3 of the fastest warships in the world, except it was 3. So, we had to once again use American privateers. American privateers had spectacular attacks on the British. They captured numerous vessels, but quite frankly, it was more important for morale than for actual strategic value. Most of the fighting would be done on American soil. So the British began an offensive. And they had been fighting at sea with the American privateers for a couple of years. But in the spring of 1814, things start to turn around. And it stems from the fact that the British had defeated the French, so they could focus strictly on the Americans. This was huge because they could send all of their supplies to the United States. August 1814, the British sailed into Chesapeake Bay with the intention of going to Washington, D.C., the capital. Now think about the strategic and the morale value, of taking the country's capital. The Capitol building and the entire government was evacuated because of this. Now, Dolly Madison refused to leave the White House. She had to make certain that the presidential portrait of George Washington was removed and safely stored. She understood the importance of that portrait, and she personally put it into a safe location. At that point, then, she evacuated. American forces were quickly overpowered, and the British marched into Washington, D.C. The Capitol and the President's Mansion were among the buildings burned to the ground. This was an extremely dark day for Americans. And if I remember correct, this day was September 11th, 1814. The Capitol was destroyed. A very symbolic date, not once, but twice in American history. Now, the British did not attempt to hold Washington, D.C. Why would they want to hold it? They'd already scared everybody out and burned it to the ground. So they left the city and sailed north to Baltimore. But there, 13,000 militiamen were waiting. The British were kept out of the city by a determined defense and ferocious bombardment from the local fort, Fort McHenry. Now, located in Fort McHenry was a lawyer by the name of Francis Scott Key. He was there to defend an American soldier or American citizen that had been taken by the British. He was then, once he entered the ship outside of Fort McHenry, he was told he couldn't leave. Well, during the night of September 13th and 14th, Francis Scott Key watched as the bombs burst over Fort McHenry. And finally, by dawn's early light, he was able to see the American flag still flying over the fort. Deeply moved by patriotic feeling and patriotism, the nationalism that he felt, he wrote a poem called, well, that's for you to answer. What was the poem called that Francis Scott Key wrote? Please write that down and turn it in to Mrs. Betts. And let's see if you know much about poetry in the United States. Now, the correct answer, Francis Scott Key's poem was called The Star-Spangled Banner, not called the national anthem. It became the national anthem, but the poem is titled The Star-Spangled Banner. So while the British are having great success in Baltimore, sorta, they were defeated. In the north, General Sir George Prevost led more than 10,000 British troops into New York State from Canada. They were going to invade from the north. They had already invaded from the east and had invaded into Washington, D.C. and into Baltimore. Now they're coming from the north down. Except they faced a humiliating defeat at the Battle of Plattsburgh. Prevost was forced to abandon the campaign, and it sealed the northern border of the United States. Now, this is also a turning point. The Battle of Plattsburgh is a huge turning point for the Americans. After Plattsburgh, the British determined that the war in North America was simply too costly and unnecessary. What does Britain gain from beating America? Continuous rebellion from a country, from the people, because they don't want to be British subjects. And in the meantime, Britain is spending numerous amounts of money and soldiers' lives. They're not trading with the Americans. They're losing trade that way. It was simply unnecessary. It made no sense. Took them 2-3 years of fighting to figure that out. 2 years of... So the war ends. December 1814 in Ghent, Belgium. A peace agreement was signed. However, before the word of the final treaty had reached the United States, one last ferocious battle took place in New Orleans. General Pakenham's British troops moved towards New Orleans, and behind fortifications was an American army led by a pretty famous general named Andrew Jackson, who'd go on to become president. After an hour of fighting, 700 British soldiers were killed. And as I said, Andrew Jackson would become president in 1828, and a lot of that was based upon him becoming a war hero in 1814. So if you click on the speaker, you can listen to Johnny Horton's song, The Battle of New Orleans. It's a very catchy tune. You can listen to it. And then it will lead you towards the final activity for this. So your activity for this section, I want you to imagine that Francis Scott Key had not been locked in this ship watching the attack on Fort McHenry. And instead, he was at the Battle of New Orleans. I want to put yourself in his position. You're witnessing the Battle of New Orleans. And I want you to rewrite the Star-Spangled Banner. I guess I shouldn't say rewrite the Star-Spangled Banner, but I want you to write me a poem based upon what occurred at the Battle of New Orleans. Now I will be listening very carefully and reading very carefully your poem to make certain that you're not taking specific terms and ideas from Johnny Horton. This has to be your own thoughts. Write this in your journal and submit it to me with your journal entry.